In the summer of 1960, Sir Alfred Hitchcock terrified audiences with what would become his most famous film, Psycho. Psycho would go on to spawn 3 sequels, all with actor Anthony Perkins, giving an unforgettable performance as Norman Bates, a character later referred to as the Hamlet of horror. Join us as we examine the impact of Hitchcock's masterpiece and its sequels, the influence it continues to have on filmmakers today, and how it endures as one of horror's most famous franchises.
Good evening. I think it would be interesting to talk about fear.
Yeah, I still think Psycho is the scariest movie ever made. It breaks all the rules. After Janet Leigh's character is killed, the only person that you have to relate to is Norman Bates. And so without knowing it, the audience is becoming the psycho themselves.
Psycho's pretty much the granddaddy of slasher films.
My mother wouldn't let me see it. When I saw it, it was brilliant, you know. I visualized chocolate being blood.
I was in high school, and I just, you'd never seen anything like that before.
That first one just blew my mind. One word, shower.
Plus, most people were going out of their minds during the shower sequence. My friend went nuts at the end when he turns the chair around and mother's
corpse face. And that was the scene that stuck with me more than any other. We used to always tease my little sister from then on for years. Mrs. Bates, stop me, stop it. It definitely, it led the course to the rest of my life.
I think there's nothing that's more exciting for an audience when they realize that the director is not playing by the rules, is not playing fair.
Psycho brought to a mass audience and a Hitchcock audience and a Universal audience the idea that the killer was not a mutant, didn't have dents in his head, could look like that nice young boy from next door. So it was definitely a watershed for that kind of film.
It was like a really low-budget movie, and nobody expected it to be the enormous hit, nor the cataclysmic event it was in terms of film history.
When Psycho was done, you have to remember that no one had ever seen anything like that before, and that was considered an incredibly explicit sequence. Having a naked woman being stabbed in the shower was something that nothing like that had ever been shot before.
You never saw really a knife pierce skin. That was always Hitchcock's brag out of it. It was all been done with montage. I have always wondered about that. I think I slowed down Lee getting killed in the shower. I think there's one shot in there where it looks as though the knife pierced his skin, even though it doesn't. It
all happens in your mind, because of the way it's so incredibly well cut together. I've gotten into arguments with people. They say, yes, you do. You see the knife going in. And I finally had to sit down with them and sort of look at it shot for shot. And you never, ever see the knife and the girl in the same shot together, really.
Well, Hitchcock was such a great marketer. If he repeated things often enough, they became truths. So he sold that as an idea to the public. I think that was a way of avoiding censorship. You can actually see a makeup patch on the stunt double's torso is actually a prosthetic, and the knife tip disappears a good inch into the body. It's only one cut.
I bet you there's a whole bunch of people here who know that I wasn't even there for the shower scene. I was in New York doing this musical comedy that I was talking about. That entire shower scene is shot with a double, with someone else playing Norman. In fact, Hitchcock didn't even want to have me doing that because he thought my silhouette, my broad shoulders and my narrow waist would give it away. And so the outline, if you'll notice in Psycho 1 of the mother, is very, very unlike my own outline. It's one of the very few cheats in the entire picture, but it's clearly not the outline of Norman Bates.
I don't like to take showers. That's the truth. I tub. And if I'm forced to, if that's the only way, I mean, to say that where I am only has a shower, has to be with the door open and I have to be able to see out. I cannot be closed in with either a curtain or a door, glass door, because I'm scared.
You know, I see different things in it every time I watch it.
You can see eyes in Mother when she attacks in the shower. That creeped me out.
Nobody really knows how they did that shot from under the water. It's one of those impossible shots. It's literally they had to arrange all of the spigots in the shower head to go around the camera not to hit it.
It was the first movie where you ever saw a toilet. Hitchcock was deliberately doing that because he wanted the audience to feel like this is, you know, we're going to uncharted territory here. Having Janet Leigh walking around in a bra and a slip in the opening of the movie, incredibly shocking. And the idea that she's not married to John Gavin and that they're having this affair during their lunch break, you know, this was, you know, unheard of. So the movie, when it came out, was a groundbreaking film.
When Arbogast is going up the stairs and Mother comes running out and kills him, I don't know if it was the music or what, but I don't think I've ever been so scared.
Literally, the audience raised out of their seats. They were airborne.
The idea of this sick old woman coming running out of her bedroom and killing somebody.
He had sketched that sequence completely of Arbogast coming into the house, looking around, and then going up the stairs.
I've also always been impressed with how people fall down stairs in the Psycho movies. I wish I could fall downstairs like that, because I usually go just like straight down and roll, but these people just like keep falling, and I've always wanted to be able to do that.
The victim tumbled and fell with a horrible crash. I think the back broke immediately and hit the floor. It's difficult to describe the way that the twisting of the
Psycho, you know, introduced the way movies should be seen.
Psycho was one of the first movies where it was very specific that you had to see this movie from the beginning to the end.
Well, I do remember seeing Psycho the very first time, and it was quite an experience. There was this sense of the whole audience just kind of panicking. They just started talking, and there was this kind of undercurrent going on for the whole rest of the movie. And I remember them yelling at the screen, you know, when Vera Miles is going to go down into the fruit cellar. And you know, she starts going down the stairs, and the whole audience is going, "No, no, go back, go back!" And then she turns around and starts to go back, and then she changes her mind and goes back down, and the whole audience is screaming at her, "No, no, no!" It was an amazing thing.
Everyone went and saw this movie. It didn't matter if you were a horror fan or not. Everyone, it was an event.
Hitchcock asked the audience not to reveal the ending, and the audiences were pretty amazing. They did not tell the surprise ending.
There has to be something about that really intrigued people. That had to be something to bring people in. They never tried that before.
I don't think anybody, other than going to like a revivalist theater, would ever get that kind of that thrill.
There was a lot of imitation that came from Psycho. Of course, John Carpenter's Halloween owes a lot to Psycho, and it was so imitated throughout the 60s. So many other suspense movies came out that had the final twist at the end.
They were trying to rip off Psycho, you know, homicidal, straitjacket.
Hysteria and Paranoiac and all those one-word title movies.
You know, William Castle did it several times.
Like a lot of people of my generation, probably the first time I encountered anything by Bob Bloch was Psycho. And it was probably the movie, not the book. I came to the books later.
Robert Bloch is the one who really introduced a whole grand guignol element to horror, which Hitchcock, of course, utilized for his film.
Like a lot of people who came to the book through the movie, I was surprised to discover that Norman Bates was like a 40-year-old overweight guy. And he didn't seem to be very much based on Ed Gein at all. You
know, in terms of the facts in the Ed Gein case, it was the idea of Gein trying to become his mother, in a sense, is really the inspiration, I think, for Psycho.
He was within range of Plainfield, had heard the story of Ed Gein and adapted certain aspects of that to his story for Psycho, but one of them was not the physical character of Norman. What interested Bob was the fact that this guy could commit these crimes in a normal, small community and get away with it for a number of years.
He's not as sympathetic as the character that Anthony Perkins played.
I think one of the keys to Joe's adaptation of Psycho is he would not work on something that didn't engage his own interest. And so those aspects of the novel that did not engage his interest, he decided to alter or change. And all of this was run through the filter of Hitchcock. Nothing was done without Hitchcock's approval. Nobody could come up with a spin on the novel if the novel didn't exist in the first place. Well, that was kind of Hitchcock's specialty. So we'll make this cinematic, but we also have to make this different enough to the point where he would want to render this as a suspense movie. Remember, at this time, they were courting Hitchcock heavily to do the first James Bond movie. Had Hitchcock done the first James Bond movie, he might never have done Psycho.
Hitch set the bar extremely high with Psycho. That is the thing that makes Psycho, to everybody, to all of us, as culturally important as it should be.
I think Psycho opened me up to visual language.
The modern thriller stands on Hitchcock. The modern horror film stands on Hitchcock. It changed, so much about filmmaking. Changed montage, changed level of acceptable violence.
It's just pure genius. It was meant to originally be an experiment in black and white film with the camera crew that was a TV crew. And it wasn't supposed to be successful.
It's the movie he's most famous for now, but it's totally different from anything else he really did. I think through that he sort of gave movies and horror a little more respect than it usually had gotten.
Hitchcock believed in telling you what was going to happen and then letting you sweat about it. Suspense was literally telling you how something was going to be resolved and then letting you wait for it to be resolved.
If you're going to tell scary stories for a living, Psycho is unavoidably part of your basic coursework at this point. I can't think of a person who is writing books or making movies in that genre now that doesn't owe a debt to Psycho. And further, I can't think of anybody who makes movies or writes book in that genre that doesn't like Psycho, doesn't hold it up as kind of a standard to aspire to.
The legends, of course, have always been that Hitchcock would never change a storyboard, that once the movie was storyboarded, it was done. That shooting the movie was almost like a mechanical process. The creative work was already finished. Tony told me a great story about when he was rehearsing with Martin Balsam for the interrogation scene. What they got into was Balsam cutting him off before he could finish his, every sentence was constantly being cut off, interrupted. In the storyboards, they were all close-ups. And what Tony Perkins knew was that if you are shooting a close-up, you cannot have interruptions. And that the way that they were rehearsing the scene was completely contrary to Hitchcock's storyboard. So he was kind of nervous about approaching Hitchcock, and he said, Hitch, I want to show you what Marty and I are doing with this scene. And Hitchcock said, I'm sure it's fine, dear boy. And he said, no, Hitch, I really think you should come and see this. And he finally got Hitchcock to watch him and Balsam rehearse the scene. And Hitchcock liked it so much, he just threw the storyboards away and completely shot it differently. Tony was saying that all of these stories about Hitchcock and the storyboards are really just kind of legends. They're not really true, that Hitchcock was constantly listening to the actors and making changes in his plan.
It was in this sandwich scene, where Norman brings the ingredients for the sandwich to Marion Craig. And Janet started really seriously asking Hitchcock about the making of the sandwich. Should she put butter on? Should she put mayonnaise on? Should she put the ham on before the cheese? Should she get it? And Hitchcock, who again, like Ken Russell, knew how to make a decision quickly, kind of stopped everything, and he zeroed in on this answer. And he had her doing it a number of different ways. And he would ask her to think, behind his back, he's like summoning the crew to come and stand around in a circle and kind of gawk at Janet as she took the sandwich. They would say, well, wait a minute, maybe it was better with the ham first before the cheese.
He's hoppy, you see was taxidermy. Crow here, an owl there.
One of the most interesting things about Psycho is what I call the bird motif, which is all throughout the film. Alfred Hitchcock has imagery and associations to birds throughout the entire film. Starts in Phoenix, which is the mythological story of the bird rising from the ashes. If you go into the office, you'll see all of the stuffed birds behind Norman are birds that are birds of prey. But in Janet's room, cabin number 1, they're all birds that would be preyed upon. As a matter of fact, when he comes into the room, discovers the murder, he knocks a picture of a bird off the wall. He tells her she eats like a bird.
He got the idea that he should be eating little kernels of corn like a bird, kind of a bird-like thing.
Of course, Alfred Hitchcock's very next movie was The Birds.
Psycho wouldn't have been as effective and as brilliant if it wasn't for Anthony Perkins' amazing performance as Norman Bates. You know, that was really Academy Award material, and he never really got the recognition he deserved for his work on that film.
In those days, he was known as the boy next door. He was which was the reason that Hitchcock cast him, is that it was completely breaking him out of the typecast that the audiences, sort of held him in.
He even had records. He was in the play Look Homeward Angel on Broadway, and he'd been in some big westerns with Gary Cooper.
Tony is a great actor, and I don't think Tony got the roles that he should have after this because everybody looked at him and he was Norman Bates.
He never played those kind of characters until that movie, and then he rarely got a chance to play anything else other than that.
He created a character with Norman Bates that, he used to say damn near ruined his career. And he'd come out to do it because he wanted to work with Hitchcock. And he had no idea that it was going to be the emblematic character that would decide a lot of, of his acting life. Because up until then, he'd been sort of a romantic lead.
An actor gets a role that fits that inner personality that's there and brings that out. That's unique. That's where you really hit and the critics go crazy about you. It becomes a stamp of your career, really. And that was his stamp. He had a hard time getting out of that. And I think that's why he really got into these other things about Psycho and stuff, is because he couldn't escape it, so he decided to have fun with it.
And he's nothing like that in real life. He's kind, sweet, loving. He's nothing like, he doesn't know Psycho, no weirdness.
Anyway, he was slated to be a romantic lead. He wasn't slated to be a reincarnation of the most terrifying mass murderer of the age.
Norman is that guy who could be standing behind you in the line at the supermarket, who could pull out a great big knife and kill you for no reason that you're capable of understanding, until it's too late, at which point you'll be dead with a lot of knife wounds in you. Now, if Leatherface was standing behind you in line at the supermarket, the danger would be obvious. If Hannibal Lecter was standing behind you in the supermarket, he would have his little flesh mask on, or his hockey mask, or his William Shatner mask.
You couldn't put Norman Bates in a room with Michael Myers and Leatherface and Freddy and Jason. He would just be sitting there like the nerd in the corner of the room, where all the other guys are getting all the chicks. But what's funny is that if the lights went out, I would guarantee 30 seconds later the lights go up and Norman's killed them all.
I've been waiting to see a horror movie actually where somebody wears a Norman Bates mask and kills people. That would be completely recursive. That would be the closure of the entire cycle back there. It's like, well, now we have active movie killers imitating Norman Bates, who was a killer in a movie.
Psycho is probably the single best-known musical motif in film history. Maybe Jaws is about on the same level.
I would love to watch the Psycho film without Bernard Herrmann's music.
You can't have Psycho without its score. And the fact that Hitchcock chose, along with Herrmann, to use only string instruments was also interesting because nobody had ever done that at that time.
I've gotten into a lot of trouble with the music from Reanimator because it's almost identical to the Psycho music that Bernard Herrmann wrote.
When I first saw it, I immediately took it as a homage. I'm not one of those people who is like, oh, he's ripping off Bernard Herrmann. I mean, it's so close, yet slightly differently orchestrated.
When I was talking to Richard Band, who was the composer for Reanimator, I said I wanted something that was Bernard Herrmann-esque, and actually wanted there to be a credit at the end with apologies to Bernard Herrmann, which ended up getting left off of the film. And so Richard, for years, has been criticized and called a plagiarist, but it was really an idea of an homage, really, to the great music. I mean, the music in Psycho is so wonderful that you could have a character brushing their teeth and you play that music and it becomes terrifying.
Psycho 2, I mean, it's got big shoes to fill. It's almost like sacrilegious. It's like making a sequel to Vertigo, or Rear Window, or The Birds. Oh wait, they did make a sequel to The Birds.
I was kind of hesitant because of my relationship with Mr. Hitchcock. So I called his daughter Pat, and she thought it was a marvelous idea.
The fact that Anthony Perkins was doing it, and Richard Franklin, who was a good suspense director, was directing it. They got a good writer, Tom Holland, who had done some genre stuff.
Richard called me up, we hit it off. I think I probably worked harder in that script than I have in almost any other, or at least I approached it with more trepidation because I was doing the sequel to Psycho, and I had sort of an overwhelming respect for Hitchcock.
The challenge of the first one was I remember, was overwhelming. So how in God's name are we going to be worthy of our predecessor here?
You didn't want to mess it up. You really had almost a moral obligation to make something that stayed true to the original and yet updated it at the same time.
We're not making a sequel just because it was a successful Hitchcock film. We're making a sequel because we think there's more story to tell about Norman Bates.
We worked hard, and then I think I checked 10 ways from Sunday to make sure that all the plot points in Psycho 2 fit in with the original. I mean, it really was, the next step, what happens when Norman gets out.
They wanted to do it right, and then they didn't want, the same as I did, to just make something that wasn't in line with the original. And after they read Tom's script, it was clear sailing.
I actually thought the story of Psycho 2 was very, very good, and because it exonerated Norman, it made him be the guy that things were being done to, and I thought that was a real good deal.
I sat there with that story, and I put that up on 2x4 cards on a corkboard. So that was worked out on a scene-by-scene basis before I even went to script on it. That's an intricately designed movie. I gotta tell you, I thought it was a terrific script. It's like a series of traps. Not only does it keeps you guessing about what's going on, but it also puts a lot of the characters that you kind of like, it puts them in danger, and it makes you feel very ambivalent about the lead character, Norman.
Richard Franklin was this Australian director who they brought over to do Psycho 2. We had done a movie called Road Games, which is a good suspenseful film with Jamie Lee Curtis.
He was a graduate of the USC Film School, and I was from USC, and he was a student of Mr. Hitchcock from the very beginning.
Richard organized a Hitchcock Festival, which was probably one of the first, most complete festivals that I think had occurred up to that point in time. We had the prints of all the Hitchcock films in our hands, some of the best studio Technicolor prints, and we analyzed them backwards and forward. It probably could not have been in better hands than Richard's.
We could have taught a course in Alfred Hitchcock. He really is extremely knowledgeable about the man's filmmaking technique.
Later on, Hitchcock invited him to the set of Topaz, so Richard got to see him at work.
Psycho 2 is one of those rare cases where they really found the right director to do the sequel, someone who was a real student of Hitchcock. They found the perfect person who really understood and respected the master, rather than someone trying to just emulate and copy him.
You could still get a hint of Hitchcock throughout that whole film. And I think it's a far superior sequel than a lot of stuff we've seen.
The most unique thing to me about Psycho, and I hope we've captured the same thing, was the tone of the original film. Norman Bates didn't even know he was a killer, and we felt great sympathy for him, and I think we still do today.
Money was for Oak Communication. It was supposed to be a cable movie. Almost on a lark, they sent it to Tony Perkins. And Tony said yes.
Perkins delivers a performance that's just totally understated. He's Norman Bates trying to put Norman Bates behind him.
It was that Norman wasn't black, Norman was gray. You had to somehow work with the quality that Tony had as a human being, as an actor. There was something vulnerable about him, at the same time there was something murderous.
Anthony Perkins makes us believe the guy who viciously murdered 2 people in that first movie is safe. That we can sit in the same room with him, we can come into his house, and nothing will happen to us. Right?
Tony was a fascinating character. He was brilliant. He was one of the smartest people I've ever met. He was a walking encyclopedia of movie trivia. He played a game where he would quote lines of dialogue from a movie, and you had to say what movie or what character or what actor had said them. I couldn't do it. But I mean, he knew dialogue going back from all these famous movies that he could quote.
While we were making the movie, Richard and I would return to Richard's house after the end of the day and just talk. Tony came to dinner with his wife, Barry Berenson. Tony would come in the wardrobe that he was wearing for the day, blood-splattered shoes, that sort of thing. Very intense. I remember sitting in the room with him and everybody had left the room and he just sort of stared and locked eyes with me for this long period, and I thought,
And then he said, by the way, you'll be wearing a dress all the way through it. I was just coming off of some kind of Winston billboard or some kind of campaign I was doing. I thought I was everything. And I go, I can't wear a dress. And he said, why not? I did.
He fought it for a long time. But then again, I guess at the end he embraced it because he realized how many people get a role like that in their lifetime, become that character. It's like his film history, you know?
If you're making a psycho movie and you're playing Norman Bates, well, you just got to be having a great time. It's the best part. It's just what it's all about. I really love it.
A really wonderful supporting cast. Meg Tilly was wonderful as Norman's love interest.
We even talked to Janet about it. And originally with the studio, I wanted Jamie Lee to play the part. Jamie Lee, well, she had just been in the Halloween stories. And for some reason, they backed off from it. But I thought it would be perfect. And when they turned that down, then we got Meg.
She's a great companion for Norman. And you almost kind of wish that she stuck around. That would have been a great sequel for that film, just to see those two go off.
The easiest thing they could have done is get a bunch of dumb kids, break in the psycho house, and Norman escaped, and they're gonna get killed by Mother. But instead, they decided to take this real high road with Psycho 2.
And I always thought that was such an interesting way to pull off a sequel, where all the other horror movies, it's just, okay, the killer's back and he's killing again. And this was such an interesting psychological angle into it. And the fact that her character started off as really being the bad guy and then kind of smartened up and tried to change it towards the end is something you've never really seen in a horror sequel before.
It depends on her performance to make us completely unaware that she's, sort of in on the gag against Norman.
She had a girlish innocence, but she had an intelligence behind it. She also had a sense of decency. Meg just is a nice girl, but she's talented and she could act. But we went with her because we thought she had the right qualities and was the best actor. And she was delightful.
Beautiful girl, so it wasn't difficult to be very supportive. She was new in the business. And she was a little trembly, but she came through. She was wonderful.
I was there when she read. It was the reading that got us. And why Tony turned against her about halfway through the shoot, I just thought she was giving a run for it as an actor, which I thought was great for the show.
As far as I saw and all the time, I felt the relationship was great. Tony wasn't that type of person to reject he would come to me or Richard ahead of time if that was the case. But no, I didn't see any animosity there.
Tony tried to get her fired and replaced.
Really?
Yeah, no, my feeling was that she was better than he expected. And I thought that, maybe he was giving her a run for his money, but he turned against her and all of a sudden really disliked her.
She was new, I know she moved on to Agnes of God and had an Oscar-nominated role. So, she's a good little actress. She just, at the time, she was green. She was very new, and he was a seasoned star. Maybe she felt uncomfortable and felt like she should push it with him. But there was friction, that's all I know. There was friction.
Well, you can feel the tension happening in that scene in the kitchen where he pulls out the knife and she looks at it. But there was that point, I think, which they disliked each other so much, or he disliked her.
There was a vague sense that something was bothering him. I think he wasn't too happy with Meg Tilly, but at that point, who had the time to think about that?
She stayed very calm during the whole thing, is my memory. I felt bad for her, actually, but she wasn't intimidated, and she didn't let her performance go.
It was great to see Vera Miles on the big screen again. She was pretty much semi-retired by then.
I love the motivation of my character. If somebody had killed so brutally a member of my family, and they were going to come out, I think I would feel just as angry.
Vera Miles getting the knife in the mouth, it's just brilliant. And especially that it was her, this old school Hollywood actress, was willing to do that is just great.
She was made up in a makeup, and they said action. She did a part. She looked up and screamed. They locked it in, and the director got the same angle as a rubber Vera Miles, about 3 feet tall on the ground, and they had a groove in her mouth, and they had to get the flash of the knife, my angle of the wrist, and it was 1, 2, 3, and I slammed the knife into her mouth. An assistant had an air pump from a bicycle with the tubing from a fish tank filled with fake blood, and he pushed it, and then blood flew out her mouth, and that's how they got that effect.
That's the most memorable death for me out of any of them.
Robert Loggia was a surprising casting choice.
God Officer and the Gentleman, and that started me off in the second half of my career. So this came along when I was on the way up to doing Scarface and Academy Award nomination and Jagged Edge and all that.
So he was really cast against type as Norman's psychiatrist. And I really thought he was wonderful in the role. Really nice seeing the relationship between him and Norman, how he looks after Norman, how he cares, and he really wants to see it rehabilitated.
If he was my therapist, I would be nervous all the time. No wonder Norman's twitchy. He doesn't want. I can't believe it. But I guess that's why he would go on to play cops and detectives in the future.
I was thinking more in terms of Marty Balsam had initiated it, and Marty was a dear friend. For me, in an odd way, it was like going to be a tribute to Marty. He was such a great guy. He was such a great actor.
Dennis Franz was in the movie, and my scene was with Dennis, and it was his first movie. So we were both very excited. And let's not please discuss the difference between my career and Dennis's career. That's okay. I love Dennis. He's a fabulous human being.
And he was absolutely terrific, and obviously went on to have a career. But De Palma was the one who discovered him. It was because I'd seen him in a couple of other De Palma movies. He's in the Travolta one, which is Blowout. I think he's one of the cops in Dressed to Kill.
It's wonderful to see his career has blossomed. And he was so, just a wonderful, sleazy, perfect motel operator for the Bates Motel.
Go on, Psycho, pick it up.
What he needs to do, what Dennis Franz has to do in the movie, is make himself so unlikable that when he finally gets killed, we're kind of glad and hope Norman did it. We hope Norman is crazy again, because if he's crazy, that guy deserved it.
It's interesting that he'd worked for De Palma, who, updated and made Hitchcock's film techniques his own, and that actor would end up in Psycho too. Yeah, he was terrific.
Dean Cundy was the DP, who also shot John Carpenter's The Thing and Halloween, of course. Went on to do the Jurassic Park movies and a lot of other huge blockbuster films.
Richard was very concerned that he matched the visceral impact of the shower murder in some way.
It was felt that if we pulled back too much, if we went too soft with it, then we weren't fulfilling where horror movies were at the time.
The most cringeworthy moment for me is when Norman Bates grabs the blade. When Meg Tilly is she's backing up to go down the basement stairs, and he just grabs that knife and just pulls on it.
You can show everything in the world of, special effects now. They can do everything. But if you cut someone with a knife, because everyone can relate to it. They're relating to just someone, stepping on a piece of glass maybe, or cutting a knife. Everyone in the audience, ugh. It's one of those reactions that you just immediately, so you can just feel, a blade cutting someone's skin.
That seemed more painful because it was long and drawn out. It wasn't a quick stab. It was just grab that thing and just slice your own hands. It was like you really realized how crazy he had gone at that point.
I love the structure of the script where at the end, Meg Tilly believes Norman Bates killed everybody. Anthony Perkins, he believes it might be her, and the audience knows it's neither of them. And yet you left, the cliffhanger. So it's almost like the movie could end when he goes back home, and then you don't reveal the ending.
Narratively, it almost echoes the first film. You got Mrs. Spool showing up, and she's just kind of explaining the whole thing. But what's great about it is Norman's expecting her.
When you think he poisoned her, and then he just can't wait and smashes her with the shovel.
He stands there, and he's got the shovel, and she's just taking a little sip, and wham! He clocks her, and he hits her so hard, the chair breaks.
That was Richard. He wanted to keep the ending hidden. He released the script without the last page or two. Okay, that's because we thought it was such a brilliant ending. We didn't want everybody and their brother to give it away.
And so first they drop this bomb on you that she's the one who killed all these people, and that's not crazy enough. One of the Golden Girls went on a killing spree, but then he hits her with a shovel.
Richard may have been the one that came up with the idea of the shovel, of killing her with a shovel. I can't remember now, but we were going to kill her. And I think we were arguing about various ways for Norman to kill Mom.
Everyone in the theater cheered at that. Because I think more so because the whole spectacle nature of it.
That's it. I had poisoned her. I think Richard added the shovel.
Right.
I think Richard added the shovel.
Who writes this kind of stuff? Tom Holland.
That's me. That's me and my mother.
Richard and I had the same sort of sense of humor, which was rather perverse. We'd laugh over murder sequences, because they were we'd be over the top when Robert Loggia got stabbed and fell over the landing and landed on the knife. I showed that to Richard and to Hilton, and dead silence for a moment after, and then we just all burst out into laughter.
I think I fell off onto some mattresses and stuff, but I did take a fall over the railing. I think I helped sell the fall. It looks very real, doesn't it? Yeah. Man, yeah.
I was, by the way, the handwriting of Mother. We all sort of on the set, the director went, give me some handwriting samples. And so we all did it. And then I was the one they chose. That was the notes written by Mother.
The discussion did come up about music, and somebody brought up John Williams. And Richard and I both said, we'd much rather have Jerry Goldsmith.
If you're going to do Bernard Herrmann, the only composer you could get was Jerry Goldsmith. And there's nobody that's come close to him.
Jerry Goldsmith walked on water. I mean, he was just wonderful. Terrific human being and extraordinarily talented.
Goldsmith, I think, like so many in our generation, he almost created a soundtrack for our youth.
Any score that Jerry Goldsmith was writing around this time is fantastic.
It was a smart choice not to just rehash the old stuff and let him do what he wanted to do, because really when you're thinking about, it's Psycho and everything else, but obviously the director wanted to make it his own movie.
It was an intimidating assignment for me as a writer, for Richard as a director, and for Jerry Goldsmith as the composer, because we were standing in the shadow of the original.
I believe Psycho 2 to be one of the best horror soundtracks ever made. From the age of 14 on, I've used Psycho 2 in almost every single movie I've made. And it's great, and it always works. I mean, it's one of those pieces that always works. Track 5, if you're doing a horror film, that is that you temp it with track 5. If your film is cut properly, it will be great. It'll work beautifully. I've used 5 in everything.
Richard rejected a theme that Jerry had written for Norman, and Jerry was like, his initial reaction was, who is this person rejecting my work? And Arthur Morton, who was his orchestrator, said, he's right. And that theme wound up being the theme to the old people in the Twilight Zone movie. We're on the scoring stage of the Twilight Zone movie, and that theme came up. And I looked at Richard and I poked him. This was our reject.
We opened at a terrible time against all these blockbusters in summertime.
The movie opened in a little over 1,000 theaters, and it did over $8 million its first weekend. It was the #1 film. It had a per-screen average of over 8,000, and this is 1983. That was really big, especially on a relatively small release that it was.
I saw the second Psycho when I was doing Police Academy in Toronto, and it opened up and we went, oh! And about 6 of us went together to go see it because we were all excited. I want to see Anthony Perkins doing that role again. And the fact that he was doing it rather than somebody else playing his role, that excited me because I knew we were going to at least get him. And that was important. And we had a fantastic time. We laughed, we cheered, we screamed, we did it all.
I thought that Psycho 2 was actually a very brilliant movie. It stands on its own, I think, as a brilliant movie.
It's a damn good sequel. And I thought so at the time, and I knew that it would last because of the quality of work that was going into it.
I mean, I've always said the first 2 Psychos are a wonderful double feature. If you watch Psycho 1 and 2 back to back, it's great because you'll get all the references and the names and all of the in-jokes they put into Psycho 2 from Psycho 1. If you watch the 2 of them, it's clear in your mind.
Tony eventually argued with Universal and eventually got the money they owed him. And he'll never work again type thing. And all of a sudden the phone rang and, hey, you want to do Psycho 3? And his answer, of course, was, if I can direct.
Actually, I had always wanted to play a suicidal runaway novice nun that ends up at the Bates Motel and falls in love with Norman. And then Psycho 3 came along.
When I went into the meeting, I just remember seeing
Anthony, and you feel that Norman is there. But then we started talking about it, and they said, "You want to read a little bit?" And I said, "Well, just do one of the scenes." I said, "You pick them." And that's when I told him I memorized the whole screenplay. Then we started doing it, and that's when I saw Norman. Now, I don't think I was intimidated, but I certainly was, he was amazing. He just flipped right into Norman like that. And we kicked it around a little bit and did a couple scenes, and the next thing you knew, I had the job.
I went to Universal and I auditioned for the casting director. She took me down to the set and another actor so that Anthony would have a choice. He left the set to come over and read us, and he had me act with a bush. I had to do my lines not with not looking at him or anything, but to the bush. And I never had this happen before, where somebody wanted me to act with a bush. But I did it, and I got the part.
I did a play called Zen Boogie, which was a rock musical. And I was the advertising for it as well. They shot me, and I was a kind of a Buddha, a laughing Buddha. And I just sat there and... and he loved that. Anthony actually remembered that. Years later, he remembered it, and he called me in because of that laugh. And he actually had me do it several times, just like I just did it now, several times to make sure that's the one that he thought would break this tension. And the more he talked, the more important I felt, and the more important I felt his character was. And by the end, I signed up immediately. I said, "Yeah, sure, let's do this. Sounds like a lot of fun."
Going to Psycho 3, going, "Oh, another knockoff, here, and a quick cash in." And this movie starts out with "There is no God," and it's shouted by a nun. And the first kill is by a nun.
I started watching it, and it began with that line, "There is no God," and I kind of peeked out my bedroom door just to make sure my parents weren't listening. I would get in so much trouble if they knew I was watching something like this.
Anything that starts with nuns being knocked off a bell tower is not going to be just a straightforward murder mystery. So you're immediately drawn in.
Perkins is at least getting his kind of Hitchcock homage right out of the way, right off the bat.
There were two homages there. There was Vertigo and there was also Saboteur. I think in the original, in the opening of the scene is a nun falls from a bell tower. That's the Vertigo part. The Saboteur part was that the nun tries to save her and grabs a hold of her sleeve, and the webbing in the sleeve comes, all the threads come undone in the sleeve, and she slides out of the sleeve, which was the Saboteur part. I think there may have been other little touches or nods. It was just my sort of little private film historian kind of joke.
We were on the sound stage, and they had built the staircase going up, and I was at a height, I guess a couple stories to get those shots with the nuns coming up. I went over to Anthony and I said, "I need something to stop them in their tracks." I said, "I know something that'll stop them. How about if I say, 'There is no God,' in that tormented moment there." And he said, "Oh yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's good. And that would stop them there, freeze them."
It was just one of those great inspired moments by a really good actress.
A year later in Savannah, Georgia, we had a screening of the film, and we're sitting there waiting on the movie, and it's black screen, and you hear me screaming, "There is no God." And I started shaking. I thought, oh my God. I mean, I didn't anticipate that was what was going to happen with that. I mean, it wasn't where it was originally placed and what it was for. But I said, okay, that did it. And that just opened the whole thing up. I said, what a unique, creative thing to do. I mean, to talk about grabbing an audience.
They had a great ad, the big full-page ad in the newspaper with Norman holding the keys, and the tagline said, "Norman Bates is back to normal, but mother's off her rocker again."
The score is really interesting. I mean, at that time, Carter Burrell had only done Coen Brother movies. I mean, he'd done smaller movies and stuff, so to pick this guy who was definitely not a Goldsmith or anything else was interesting. And the score, again, completely different from 2, completely different from 1. So it's those 3 movies really make themselves their own.
The one thing I didn't like about 2 was they mess with the overall mythology of the Psycho legend. Mother has to be Mother. You know, it's not going to be his aunt coming in at the last minute. And so I wanted to take all that story and turn it on its head and bring it back to, yes, the mother that tortured him was actually his mother, it wasn't this other woman, and just reinstate the original mythology.
I definitely remember watching Psycho 3 knowing that Anthony Perkins had directed it and seeing how much he was trying to sort of bring it back around again to the first one.
The only film that Tony ever referenced for Psycho 3, he took the entire cast and crew and gave us a screening of Blood Simple, which was, I think, the first Coen Brothers movie, which was a great example to show us. I mean, it was the tone, it was that kind of off-kilter tone, humor coupled with fear and tension and all that sort of thing. So that was his one example in terms of referencing movies.
Tony had a clear-cut view on everything he wanted to do, and no one, including Mr. Hitchcock, knew Norman Bates as well as Tony knew Norman Bates.
I remember for the first month or two before the movie, I'd go up to the house and he'd be walking around the yard with this device, this rangefinder from his neck, and he would be aiming it at different items and have people walk and talk and looking at every imaginable director's book there is, everything. And the first day on the set, the DP, Bruce Surtees, walked up and says, "Tony, this shot up the stairs, how would we shoot this? I mean, it's impossible to shoot it coming down and blah, blah." And I know nothing about directing. And Tony looked at him and goes, "Well," and he said that in front of a lot of people, putting Tony on the spot. Tony goes, "Well, first of all, Bruce, if we use a baby here and a so-and-so 5K there, and we shoot it with the 16 millimeter or whatever, and we pull back here, we come around the corner, if we come back and we hit the 8 spot there, and 7 seconds in, we should swirl it back around, by that time bracket out, and then time it with another light, this and that, I think we'll get it." And Bruce Surtees looked at him and he goes, "I apologize and will never question you again." He studied. He studied for so many months to be a director. He was great for his first shot out.
He was just so, I thought, intuitive and insightful and not pretentious. He ate with the cast and crew. He was just all about movie making as a collaborative art, and he was, excited to be doing it. He was very cool that way. I adored him.
Well, I think it's always great to work with directors who are actors or who have acted, and they have their act together.
I remember one time I was sitting there and he came up to me, and his direction to me was, he just sort of sat down and went, "There's a guy who's you've been waiting on for about 5 years, and he's finally asked you out, and you have an hour to get ready." Instead of telling me, be louder, faster, simpler, he gave me an actor adjustment that I could totally play, and he rocked that way.
I saw him in 3 different modes. I saw him comedic, having fun, just joking around, making fun of himself, making fun of the picture and, lightening things up. And then I saw him very serious, working on problems, trying to solve things that weren't going well, or just getting the choreography down for the movement of the camera and all that stuff. And then I saw him passionate, and the passion was the thing that impressed me the most as an actor, because that's what we look for.
We were shooting a scene outside the motel. It was a daytime scene. And the trolley came up, for the Universal tours. And he just turned, started waving in the middle of the scene. He said, "You gotta wave, Jeff. Everybody that comes past, every one of them, we're gonna tell somebody else. There's 7 tickets up from every person." I mean, and he went into this whole thing about how important the audience was and that it wasn't a big deal. It's a big deal for them to drive by the Psycho house and have Norman Bates wave to them. They'll never forget it. And it's not such a big deal for us, and it's not that difficult, so just turn around and leave. So he was on his game, yeah.
To this day, and I've been to a whole lot of barbecues. I've done somewhere in the neighborhood of 160 jobs. He is my favorite director ever. Well, I have never to date seen a director who worked equally as well with the crew and the actors. One time the crew had just spent like an hour and a half laying down track, and he walked in and he went, "I don't think I'm going to use this." And they were like, "Okay, no problem. What do you want?" I mean, it was sort of like everybody was excited to do what he wanted. There was no like, it wasn't like that.
The Duke is the coolest character I think I've, next to Jack Burton. Anybody who will be on his deathbed practically and go, just stay off the guitar, you know, it's like, just leave the guitar alone. Like, that's how badass he is.
I found him kind of scary, you know. I thought he was really intimidating. Yeah, he was very good in his role because I think that came across.
Everything that Norman impresses this guy celebrates and throws it in your face.
One of the coolest things in Psycho 3 is that the only big scare in the movie is when Jeff Fahey jumps up behind Norman Bates in the car. And not often in a horror movie do you see the big scare be one of the good guys jumping up and scaring the bad guy. And that kind of just goes to show why Norman Bates was so interesting, because even at that point, at the end of the movie, he's done all these horrific things, you're still kind of rooting for him. You don't want anything bad to happen to Norman because you feel so badly for him.
Again, why Norman is sympathetic is because he himself, his natural impulse is to be good, is to be a decent person, and he's trying to be a decent person. Anybody looks pretty good next to Dwayne is because he's such a sleazebag. Part of that whole scene was doing a twist on what we remember is Norman taking the bodies to the lake and dumping them in the lake. The victim becomes the killer, and it sends Norman in the car down into the lake. I mean, it's like Norman has descended into the hell of his own making, and just meeting your victims and being immersed in your own hell, which is what I loved about that scene.
We're in one of the biggest sound stages at Universal, and so you've got 4 walls up, and I remember there was just so many people, and I was supposed to be naked, and I've never really done this before.
Well, you know, you got 30 people around and you're walking around naked. Somebody's trying to set a light over there under your ass.
And I asked him if we could get a little less people here, and he said, okay, well, I'll clear the set. So he takes his microphone and he says, clear the set. There was still like 100 guys around, and I'm like, is that it? And he goes, that's it, darling.
He had some really dangerous choices in that movie. Stuff I'd never seen before, and stuff I love because it's wildly theatrical. There's this one thing where the light under the door jamb becomes the knife blade reflected in light. There was another thing where he walks out of a hospital room and he closes the door and he's right in Mother's bedroom and they're having a discussion. Again, this wildly theatrical transition that nobody but Tony, someone like Tony, would have thought of. And so I was just delighted when those little things happen.
The phone booth kill is definitely, a giallo type of sequence.
And the first one, when you saw the shower scene, you knew something was coming. Even though the music hadn't started yet, there was already suspense in there. With the phone booth, it happened so quick, I just remember being like, okay, I didn't see that coming.
It's shocking, like the shower scene in the original, but in a different kind of, more visceral way. I mean, we're seeing her feet on the glass. No matter what you think about that character, you cringe. You have to. And maybe she's not the nicest person or the most innocent person either, but she's in a completely vulnerable, scary, horrible situation. It's vicious.
It was supposed to be that. The equivalent of the shower scene, and it was going to be historic.
Between the blood flying, the girl screaming, the tumbleweeds, the phone book spinning, one scene could take many, many hours to set up.
Tony was really cautious about safety, and he's like, check this out, and I want you to touch it and touch it hard and see that it can't slice you, and because I want you to be comfortable. So he wanted me to go all out with regards to emotion or screaming, and he just wanted me to feel safe.
It's also weird because it's it's a love story. It's Norman Bates gets a girlfriend, and you're just like, didn't see that one coming.
Here's a guy who was committed, who's killed all these people, and somehow chicks don't mind. I know guys who've cheated on somebody before and no girls will come near him, but this guy kills people. He's like, but it's all right, I'm okay now, and every girl just falls for him. And they're like 20 years younger than him. And in that regard, I guess I've always wished I could be Norman Bates.
He was too cute, just so sweet. I would, my heart, I would just get kind of fluttery when I was around him at times. And I'm going, oh God, Anthony and I have to kiss today. I'm going, oh. Because I felt that about him. I mean, we felt a connection.
The audience from frame one was right with Norman, and when he and Diana Scar would get into that clinch and fall on the bed, the whole audience actually erupted into applause.
I wanted him to have this love affair. I wanted him to find something good, because we really like Norman. I mean, yes, he's a mass murderer and all that, but again, he's trying so hard to be good.
It's like a friend knowing, like, hey, maybe you don't want to, be with that guy. We know too much about him, and it's just like, and you can't tell people, but you see that spark, that good that we want to see in each other, and the hope, of love, new love, beginning, without knowing anybody's past. Hopefully it would be that way, and it kind of was that way, I think. I think that's part of what the audience was rallying for, too, that sweetness and some happiness.
It was one of the most difficult parts I've ever done. And it's funny because I'm only alive in, I think, maybe the first quarter of the movie. I mean, I have just like maybe 3 or 4 scenes where I'm alive, and the rest of the movie I'm dead. And he carries me around dead because he was in love with my dead corpse. He would, after every take, say, "How was it for you?" Like we just made love, that was his thing. How was that? But he was very funny. I mean, he made me laugh a lot. And you wouldn't think that of Norman Bates.
They needed a body double for me when he's looking through the peephole and he sees, Maureen undressing, and you just see the back of her butt. And he told me one day, he said, "Diana," he said, "I had to see actresses for a body double for you." And I said, "Oh," and he said, "Yes." He said it was extremely bizarre and unusual to have these women come into my office and take their clothes off. And he said, and I had to think about, Diana, and what might she look like? And he said it was very unusual.
We chit-chatted a little bit about, minor stuff, and then finally he sighed and he said, "Well, I have to ask you to take your clothes off." And I said, "Sure. That's why I'm here." So I slipped my dress off and I stood before his desk in my bikini and turned around. And he said, "Ah, you're perfect."
I said, "Well, she's lovely. Look at that."
I remember we were sitting on the steps of the Psycho House. It was just Tony and Jeff and me. And I remember telling him, "See you later." And he had said loud enough for me to hear. And he goes, "Now that's my red." As I was walking away from him, and I looked at him with my Farrah Fawcett mane, and I looked at him, and I just smiled. And he just made me feel special.
We absolutely disagreed about everything. Whatever was my favorite movie he had done, he thought it sucked. Whatever I thought wasn't my favorite, he loved it. If I loved a movie, he hated it. We argued about everything. And I think he thoroughly enjoyed that. And I remember he would be like, "Lee, come sit over here." And he'd want me sitting beside him. I think partly because I wasn't fawning. I'd talk politics, I'd talk sports, I'd talk, movies, whatever he wanted to talk about. And basically, I think he loved the fact that we disagreed on everything. He just kept cracking up.
Roberta Maxwell and I were good friends. We had done Popeye together. And so we decided to go wandering into Norman's house, which is actually just a shell. There's no interior whatsoever. You walk in and it's dirt. It's still very eerie in there. Just knowing you went through the door and you saw the window above and, wind's blowing the curtain a little bit, so you're going, "Ooh, this is very strange," You start connecting to the feeling and all that stuff. And we go in and we're talking, and all of a sudden we hear, "Mother? Mother?" And we both, I'm sure that I had to change my shorts. Roberta made out a little scream, and we both turned around, and Tony was standing there laughing his head off at us. And it was absolutely hysterical.
He was evil. I had to be in this ice chest. And instead of using fake ice, Anthony didn't think fake ice looked good enough. He put me in an ice chest with real ice. With ice. I had on shorts. I don't know if you remember the outfit. He says, "Oh, well, I'm only going to have you in there 3 seconds. And then I went into this ice chest and he covered me up with real ice and he closes the lid. And I was just like, I was blue. That's why I looked blue and dead. It was, I was literally blue.
My wife and I had actually talked about getting married on the Psycho set, figuring that Universal would, give us a great honeymoon if we did it publicity-wise. And Tony Perkins, who is a Universal Life minister, he's one of those mail-order ministers, if we got Tony Perkins to marry us at the Psycho House, we then we figured, nah, we better not trivialize something as important as a wedding.
I remember being in the Hitchcock theater, watching Psycho 3 with Anthony Perkins and with Hilton Green, and it's Hitchcock's theater, named after Hitchcock, right next to Stage 12, where the original was shot at Universal Studios. So it was fascinating and exciting, and then the movie starts, and then you're inside this whole thing, and the visuals, it's bigger than life. Yeah, there were a lot of great feelings that I had in the beginning.
It's a kind of film, I think, that people, after they see it, would just stimulate conversation about something over and beyond that it was a horror film.
I remember it fondly because I had such a good time working with it. It was such a lovely collaborative experience to be working with a major player like Tony, and I have nothing but good memories of it, and the cast, who were all sweet people and good people.
Tony loved making it, and Tony never got his feelings hurt about bombs. He was too busy moving on to the next project. Tony wished everybody the best and never had an unkind word. He always say, how could that possibly help that person?
The trouble with Psycho 3, it turned out, you never know about these things until it's sometimes too late or just right or whatever, but you don't know until later. We didn't realize that really with Psycho 3, we were almost retelling the story of Psycho 1. There was too much of Psycho 1 and Psycho 3 in it. So that's why I think it was one of the reasons that people didn't respond to it as much as they did.
I really wanted to do it. I had just made my first feature not long before that. And even though it was for Showtime and for cable TV, it was something I really wanted to do, and I was not really an established filmmaker at that point.
The great thing about Psycho 4 is they went back to the screenwriter Joseph Stefano, who had written, of course, adapted the film for Hitchcock. So it was nice that the series kind of came full circle and they got Stefano back.
And when they told me that the writer that wrote the original Psycho had written this, I was like, oh my God, I've got to be part of this, because it's a classic. In its genre, it's a classic film.
Joe Stefano made a very specific choice not to take 2 and 3 into consideration. He just used the original movie as the source.
He would only go back into it if he could invent a completely different take on the material. And I think he was satisfied that Psycho 4 was a different enough take to engage him as a screenwriter, to the point where A, he was barely rewritten at all, and B, he rather liked the finished product, a whole lot.
It really is more of a direct prequel sequel to Psycho than it was to do with the first or second sequels.
Psycho 4 follows Norman, now married, and he's living with his wife, who is a psychiatrist at an institution, ironically. And one night he calls into a radio talk show, and the subject is matricide. And ironically, one of the guests that the talk show host has on is Dr. Leo Richmond, who was, of course, in the first Psycho movie, the guy who gives that whole talk at the end about Norman no longer existing.
Warren Frost was just an actor who we read in LA before we went, and he was just so perfect. He ain't Simon Oakland, but the character is the same character. Physically, they're very different types, but I like that age-wise, he could have been the same character that Simon Oakland played.
So we now see through flashbacks Norman as a kid, Norman as a teen, to the time where he murdered his mother and her lover.
I mean, the casting was so great. First of all, Henry Thomas, since E.T., has always been one of my favorite actors.
I just graduated high school, and they met with me and talked to me about the film. I was kind of excited about having an opportunity to play Norman Bates, because it's such a iconic character.
We went to meet with him in San Antonio, and he was 18 years old, and I met him. He walked into the restaurant, and oh my God, he's this tall, lanky, his presence is very much like Perkins. Now, I found out later that Tony used shoulder pads all the time, but Henry looked very much like he could have been Norman Bates at 18.
Really, the only person that I felt intimidated to meet about the project was Anthony Perkins, whom I didn't meet until the first day of shooting on the set I had a meeting arranged with him in his trailer where we sat down and discussed the character of Norman Bates. Honestly, like when I went into the trailer, he seemed like, looking back on it now, he seemed like he was just, he knew he had to have this conversation with me, but I don't think he was really into it, you know? He was just kind of like, okay, kid, you know, well, that's good. What do you think about this guy? What do you think he wanted to know what I thought first, which I thought was very accommodating. And then afterwards, he just gave me a few broad strokes, basically saying, however you play this guy, basically play him real.
Mother was incredibly difficult to cast. We saw a lot of people, I don't even remember who else we saw, because once we met Olivia, everybody fell in love with her. Everybody literally got a crush on her. Studio executive, producers, all of these guys. She was still breathtakingly beautiful as she was in Romeo and Juliet when she was 15 years old.
I was very lucky I didn't have to audition for it. I was sent an offer. I read the script, I loved it, and I saw myself as Norma Bates. I'd never played a crazy lady before, so I wanted to try that.
And the weird thing about it is, though, you're casting a woman who has to only be 40-ish or so, and yet the voice we've always associated with her is an old crone's voice. And so Joe Stefano says, and it's in the script, that she aged in my mind.
When I first read the script, I thought they'd want me to gain some weight and maybe gray my hair out a bit, and but then when I met Mick Garris, and he said, we wanted to be as beautiful as possible. I was in heaven, he said low-cut dresses, and then I was in the makeup chair when we first started, and Anthony walked in and he sat next to me, all intense the way he was, and he said, so what are you going to do with her? And I said, I'm going to make her nuts. That was my big thing, was she could be beautiful on the outside, but tormented and insane on the inside, because she was, I played a schizophrenic and bipolar. That's what I thought.
I think when Joe Stefano sat down to do Psycho 4, he wanted to make Mrs. Bates as attractive as character as Norman is in the first movie. So Mrs. Bates, by definition, by first flush, the first time you see her, basically, you go, hey, Mrs. Bates is kind of hot, but she's kind of crazy.
The fact that they made Mother hot is weird, because I remember there's one shot with nudity in it when he's watching her, and it was like, damn, Mother's hot. No, you can't say it, but that made me feel disgusting and dirty as a viewer, because I thought she was hot and he thinks she's hot, and you're like, oh, that's gross. Like, what if you had a hot mom like that? I don't think my mom's hot. Ugh.
We knew that the first murder was going to be a major set piece. We didn't want it to be like the shower scene. I wanted it to be colorful and shocking, literally colorful. I wanted the scarlet to be quite present. And a long build-up, and a sense of visual exaggeration. The colors, it's sexuality, it's a thwarted orgasm, is what that murder was intended to be. The spurting blood, because he's not capable of making love and emitting the proper fluids at the conclusion of that act.
Wow.
So this was intended to be an act of sexuality, repressed sexuality taken out, instead in an act of destruction rather than creation. So I hope that doesn't sound too pretentious.
No.
And I didn't talk about that with many of the people involved in it, but that was the intent.
I think I was too young to quite grasp all the nuances of what Mick was doing with the orgasm analogy, but yeah, I mean, it was effective. It was actually a pretty brutal, frightening scene.
Also, the repressed passion that Henry Thomas has in that was so much that when Henry is doing the knife kill itself, it's a real butcher knife in his hand, and he's stabbing into like an ice cream tub, a cardboard tub.
And they basically set up a plastic bucket with a significant amount of blood and a piece of balsa wood floating in the center. And that was my target.
And every time he'd hit it, it would splash up onto him. He did it so ferociously. There's no hilt on a butcher knife.
I kind of overamped, and I went through the bucket and through the balsa wood and into the hardwood, and the chef's knife that I had stopped. My hand kept going.
So it slid and sliced the meat of his hand. He's still got a pretty nasty scar right here.
That's my souvenir.
You still have the scar, huh?
It's my souvenir from Psycho 4, and that was kind of in the beginning. So I had stitches for most of the movie, and I had some nerve damage on my hand for a while. It was kind of like this, and I couldn't open it.
This is the hardest thing to heal because of the working of the hand. It's constantly going to make a mouth out of that wound.
Originally I was thinking, because I lived nearby it, that I was just going to drive home and get cleaned up there, but it was so messy, and I thought, no, I can't do that. And so I had this very nice trailer, my own little shower and everything, and I took off the robe, and I got in the shower, and I'm washing everything off, and I looked down, and I realized that I'm seeing all of the blood swirling down the drain. I was like, oh my god, I'm doing Psycho, and I'm living Psycho, watching this blood swirl down the drain. Yeah, it kind of creeped me out, actually.
I would say challenging is probably the best way to put working with Perkins, because he would latch onto a word. I would say something like, obviously we don't want to go camp in this. And then it would go into a long discussion about the word camp and do you think the last movie was camp? And what do you mean by camp? And literally a half hour about what camp means. And so he would also test, and usually in front of a full crew when you're waiting to get a shot done. I remember one scene in particular where he gets upset, and it was scripted that there's an apple, he's making apple pie, and he takes a butcher knife and slams it into the table. Right as we're about to do it, we're setting it up with the director of photography and I, and the whole crew is there, and we're getting ready to do it, and he goes, "Now Mick, this knife thing, I mean, hasn't it been done before to death? It's so hoary and old and stupid." And we had gone over every page of the script together, table readings, and just making sure everybody was in agreement on where it was going. So I said, well, I kind of like it, frankly. But it led to a really long, embarrassing moment, and the crew just sitting and standing and waiting. And I just said, "Tony, why don't we step off the stage and talk about it? You guys light, you continue setting up, and then we'll figure out the specifics of it." And so we came up with, it led to that, anger so much that he splits the apple in half, which is even better. It's great. So it came out of that, but I mean, that was fairly typical throughout. And it was obvious that he had wanted to direct the film, and no matter who was directing it, it would have been difficult to earn his respect. Nature and nurture, it's been an argument that's gone on as long as there's been philosophy. I think both are equally valid. And both contribute tremendously to who a person is.
Well, my thoughts are that Norman, a lot of it came from his mother, but a lot of it it was a mixture of everything, because I actually had a friend that was very schizophrenic and mentally ill when I was around 17 years old. And he would go from being just a sweet, nice person to being a monster. I mean, he'd turn around and hit you. He'd lash out and punch you in the stomach, and you'd sit there and think, what just happened? This friend of mine that, So, and I got a lot of my ideas on how to play Norma from this person that I knew. So I think it was a mixture of, yes, I think he had her genes. So a schizophrenic person, 98% of the time will have a child that has that problem in them. That has to be taken care of with medication, and if they don't, he was his mother's son. But I think a lot of what happened to him and the fact that he became such a crazed killer had to do with the way she reared him. That's what I feel.
it was such a good, real way to show how this guy got so messed up and didn't understand reality. I mean, I can't even imagine, you know, like, here's this character who's at this very impressionable age when you're first starting to learn about women, and your mother won't let you look at any other women, won't let you talk to any other women. Everything's got to be with her. And all of his first sexual experiences were basically with his own mother, but if he looked at them as sexual experiences, he was punished for it.
She raised Norman very awkwardly. You don't punish a boy by putting him in a dress. You don't taunt him and have him pat rose water on you and then roll on the floor with you, and when he gets an erection, get furious with him and lock him in a closet. Literally in a closet, in a dress.
Actually, out of the whole film, the closet thing and the rolling on the floor to me was the most upsetting, because I have 2 boys of my own, you know, and I could not imagine ever treating my kids that way. So that was a really hard scene for me to shoot, being a mom. It was very difficult, and I had to keep saying to Henry, I'm really sorry, I'm nothing like this. Now let's get on and do this. You know, it was a tough, that was the hardest scene, I think, for me to shoot.
His relationship with his mother and just the kind of skewed view of morality and what was good and what was bad, and ethically, like how he had been treated, it definitely shaped him.
Would that drive someone to physical violence without having a proclivity that maybe they were born with in their brain, their synapses, how they work? I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. I had a script to work with that I thought worked really well.
Well, I think one of my fondest memories of the whole film was actually being in Florida as an 18-year-old kid. It was the first film that I had ever done where I was by myself. My mother wasn't with me. I felt like a grown-up. It was my first foray into being an adult actor.
The first time Mick screened it at Universal, it was just for a few of us and Anthony Perkins. And when it was over, he rushed down to Mick and said, "This is by far the best of the sequels." And he was just so thrilled. I think Mick being a new director and being so young, that Anthony really felt he had to test Mick a lot, test him while they were shooting. And it was very hard for Mick. But he won Mr. Perkins' admiration.
It was great to work with one of the icons of Hollywood. And to work with a movie star who was challenging, even bordering on difficult at times. It was a great education for a young director who had only made one movie before and a couple TV shows. But so it was difficult and challenging and educational and really worthwhile. I'm really glad I did it, but I'm glad that not all actors are like that.
Norman Bates is definitely the most sympathetic villain in horror history. Anthony Perkins brought this amazing pathos to the character.
Anthony Perkins obviously is a very talented actor, but the thing that he did with Norman Bates that's so different from what anybody else has done with a killer is he played it so real. He was so subtle in everything he did. He was so real and he was so sympathetic. And that's why Norman Bates is timeless.
Sometimes an actor sort of has a character in his back pocket, that character that they can always pull out, but it's truly a characterization. And that's what that was for him. It was so powerful that, it was indelible and people can't get it out of their heads, and that's who Tony is to many people.
The thing about a really good character is that you have to love him and hate him. And Tony's personality, first of all, Norman isn't far from who he is, the dark side of who he is, in my opinion. And that's why he portrayed it so well. But there's a certain part of Tony that brings the vulnerability to Norman. And that's why people fell in love with Norman. Because you wanted to like him, you liked him, and you wanted to know what ticked and why he did what he did.
Looking back, it's interesting, isn't it? Because sometimes when you look back and we're having this long conversation about Tony, he's gone, Yeah. Maybe we shouldn't wait so long to look back.
There are certain people, I think, born to play certain roles. And that's the magic of filmmaking, is when somebody, the right people at the right time, arrive, and you know it when you see it on film. And he just had that little franchise down, And I think it was very, the word I would say is, I think Norman was very dear to him, and not in a precocious or possessive way. I think he just felt him in his heart. And I don't say this lightly. I think he was a remarkable man.
For the time that I spent with him, I cherished that because it was beyond what I had imagined. I thought it was going to be a short meeting. I didn't really think I was going to take the project. I went there out of curiosity, and I was rewarded with an incredible time and an experience that I truly remember. And I've had a lot of experience. I've done a lot of films, a lot of television, and half of them I don't remember anymore, because you just keep going on and keep doing them. That's your job. But his sticks with me. I felt when I left that experience that I was a friend of his. He made you feel like that. And so when he passed on, we lost a friend, and I miss that. I miss any creative force, a good creative force. And I thought he had great qualities about his ideas and the way he handled himself with a cast and crew.
It was just a very wonderful experience being with him. Cherish it always, and like I said, I fluttered in his presence. I see. Because he's no longer here, and sometimes we try to do good, and I'm sure he must have thought, oh, this is my legacy, this weird, psychotic, evil person that I played, this that has kept me remembered in my craft out there. But I think, like you said, that he came to terms with that, to see that too was a vehicle.
Tony was always happy to be working. He would read most scripts. He would enjoy most things. If it was coming home and feeding the bluebirds with peanuts. But most important of all, I know it won't be in your documentary, but Tony lived for his wife, his sons. And he gave 100%. He was honest. He was honest to his craft. He never lied to anybody. And he passed on with dignity. He lived his life to the fullest. I was there in his last breath. I was there. And I was blessed. There'll never be another Tony. Never. I would never try or pretend to be him. He was just a great man.
Well, people only think of me in horror films, or people only think of me as Norman Bates, or people actually call me Norman Bates. Well, they do. Well, let me put it to you this way. They used to. People used to say, "Hey, Norman," and now that would be their way of greeting me. And I guess it was a perfectly all right way. It was my resistance to it that made them keep doing it, But as soon as I got hip to the idea that my resistance to that was what was probably permitting it to happen in the first place, I dropped all that, and then people started calling me Tony. So I don't know. I think I took I was able to kind of get the idea that my career and I were two different things. So they may associate my career with the horror genre, but I don't know. That doesn't really get to me anymore. Although it used to. It used to really used to bug me.
Psycho will always be relevant because every horror fan should put that on the top of their list and should see Psycho over and over again.
To this day, there's still only one real Psycho. We all know that.
You've got Bob Bloch, Joe Stefano, Hitchcock, Bernard Herrmann.
Psycho was the first of its kind. and will always be iconic. You know, there'll never be another Beatles, there'll never be another Psycho.
If the gothic monsters of the Universal horror movies of the 40s are the Beatles, and you get to the Atomic Age 50s and the creature from the Black Lagoon is Elvis, then Norman comes along and he's like David Bowie in drag.